Welcome to the Good Monsters Podcast. I am your host, Cody Lawrence. This is the podcast where I yell at Christians and people who think they're Christians for not being Christian enough. We believe, and by we I mean I and the Bible, that people who call themselves Christians, or in other words, people who claim to follow Jesus, ought to actually do what he and the rest of his word says. So, prepare yourself for lots of offensive talk about bad Christians, if you can call them Christians, bad pastors, if you can call them pastors, and bad churches, if you can call them churches, and what we should do about it. You are listening to the Good Monsters Podcast. Welcome to the Good Monsters Podcast. My name is Cody Lawrence, and in this podcast, we challenge Christians to be more Christ-like. Today, we are going to be talking about church abuse. Specifically, my own personal story of church abuse. Now, hold on. Don't click off just yet. I know what you may be thinking. Typically, when people cry about church abuse, at least on the popular posts on social media that I see, typically, they say things like, "My church said I was a sinner, and I don't like that." But I mean actual church abuse, church leadership abusing, in this case, a staff member, myself, by using power and manipulation, threats, and misuse of Scripture. So let's get right into it. I volunteered in youth ministry and in church in general for years, since I was in high school, and probably even before that, quite a bit. But anyway, I started my ministry journey mostly in high school, and I was volunteering in youth ministry and volunteering in other events at the church to help out in any way that I could. I became a lot more spiritually involved in high school and in college. And long story short, I went to go be a missionary. I thought that ministry was the path that I wanted to go in my life, and that hasn't changed. So here's a note. Remember that in spite of my entire story, I still want to be in ministry. It's a bad story. It's rough. It's rough than probably what most people experience when they think of church abuse. I'm not saying all. I'm not saying my story is worse than all people's, but knowing that most people think church abuse is a church calling them a sinner and them not liking what they're hearing, this is far, far worse than that. And by the way, you are a sinner. I'm a sinner. And so that's not church abuse. But the story that I'm about to tell you absolutely is. I have dozens of examples of this. I'm not going to say what the church is, and I'm not going to mention the pastor by name. Although if anybody knows me and you are listening to this, you know exactly who it is. And I honestly pray that one day the pastor will listen to this and that he will change his ways, because the things that he is doing and is allowing to happen in the churches that he works at is it's terrible. It's unacceptable, and it's frankly sad. So I grew up in this ministry environment, wanting to, dedicate my life in as many ways as I could to the church. And then later went off to Japan to be a missionary for a year, and I wanted to continue to pursue ministry. And that's when a pastor who I knew who lived where I used to live before I went to Japan, he moved off to Washington, and that church wanted a youth pastor. And so he called me up because we were relatively close. Whenever I went to his church, where I lived before Japan, I went to his weekly Bible studies. We talked about a lot of surface level stuff like movies, and I was taken by his rhetorical skills. And I wanted to learn a lot of the things that he knew. and I thought it was a good experience. And I decided to accept the opportunity and go off to Washington. And I joined this church to be a youth pastor. I didn't know a lot. I knew almost nothing about the church, honestly, except for what he told me. And I trusted him. I trusted he was a good dude because I had no reason to think otherwise. And actually, I did have reasons to think otherwise, but I was blind to those. And I will get into that momentarily. But anyway, I accepted this job, and it was my first professional ministry job in America. You know, I was a professional missionary in Japan, and that was its own totally unique experience. You know, that wouldn't prepare me much. Well, it prepared me quite a bit, but it was, the challenges that you might experience as a missionary in another country are, some of them might be similar, but there are quite a few differences than the challenges you will experience in your own country working in ministry, especially if you're a pastor like I was. So anyway, there were some red flags, some of which I was blind to, and some of which I recognized, but either was talked out of it by the pastor or I just chose to ignore it because the benefits were too great. Like, I'm going on this big adventure. I'm in another state. I have this prestigious position, and and the benefits outweighed the negatives. But knowing what I know now, and hopefully what I am able to pass on to you, you might be able to see some of these things if you choose to go into ministry one day, or even if you're not in ministry and you are just a member of a church, you might see these things in your own church. And I hope you don't leave unless these things are so great and you have no power to change them, then you probably should leave. But if you see them happening, you should be encouraged to do whatever is in your own power to fix them where you are. So anyway, here's what the red flags were. Keep in mind that I was hired to be a youth pastor. And right off the bat, in the job listing, the church, specifically the pastor who wrote the job description, he lied about the youth ministry size. The job posting said the youth ministry was about 70 students. And it was about 70 students, maybe once, months before I got there during some kind of special event. It was never consistently 70 students. The youth ministry used to be a lot bigger years ago, but was in a slow and steady decline for the past few years. And for some reason, they wanted to talk up the youth ministry. And this was also a cultural thing in the church. The church held the youth ministry very highly because it was, at one time, years ago, the largest youth ministry in the city. And at this point, even though it was advertised as 70, and it used to be as high as 200, it had gone down to about 30. And the day that I showed up, and was the first Wednesday, because the youth ministry ran on Wednesdays, the previous youth pastor, it was his last day, and he was doing like a handoff to me and introducing me, and it was a pretty good thing. But about 40 students showed up to that, and that was on his final day, and so you could expect more students being there. And anyway, the numbers were massively inflated, and that will become a theme throughout the rest of our story. If you are a part of a church who likes to inflate or even place higher importance in numbers than should be placed, you have a problem. And that's exactly what this church did, and I think it ultimately stemmed from the pastor. So they lied about the youth group size. It was an outright lie. It just wasn't true. It wasn't that he was misinformed. It's that he outright lied. In addition to that, because the youth ministry was in a steady decline over the past few years, I, as a result, heard from not only the pastor, but from many of the church members, terrible things about the youth pastor before me, the one who passed the youth ministry off to me and who trained me for about a week before he left the church. And man, it was rough, because I thought when I got there that he was this awful dude, that he was disillusioned with ministry, that he was just tired and wanted to leave the church. And because of his disillusionment and his tiredness, that the youth just slowly stopped going. And I realized, maybe that's true to some extent. Maybe he wanted to move on. But he went off to start his own church after that. And now it's going quite successfully. But what I didn't know before that was the church had another youth pastor, and he was part-time. So there was 2 youth pastors, and the part-time youth pastor wanted to be full-time, and the church wouldn't give him a full-time salary. And so he just moved on to another job, and they chose not to hire somebody else. And so the youth ministry declined, because you can't support that many students with one youth pastor, much less with the 2 that they had. So the numbers were they just got lucky and had that many students. Because if you read books, you would know that you can't support 200 students consistently with 1.5 employees, or a full-time and a part-time employee. Anyway, so I was hearing terrible things about him, and I didn't even connect that was unbiblical, that they should not be talking down this guy who did so much work at their church for over a decade, by the way. So he wasn't just at the church for a couple of years. He was working at that church for well over a decade, and they were talking him down like he was some horrible person, which led me to believe, not only like when he was training me, I wasn't sure about him. I was like, I don't know what to think about this guy, is what he's telling me. I put my relationship with him in the context of what the pastor who brought me to church was telling me, which was, he's a bad guy. Don't listen to him. And that just wasn't good. That was a big red flag, but I was blind. I was absolutely blind. I was naive. And I see these things now on this side as very bad and dangerous. So anyway, he left, and all of those things about him led me to believe that I was going to be the superstar to save the youth ministry. And because the church somehow could sustain 200 kids before, I would raise it from 30 back up to 200. And boy, was I wrong. And boy, was the church wrong for making me believe that. One of the first books that I read as a youth pastor was called Sustainable Youth Ministry. And if I remember correctly, in the first chapter of the book, it talks about the dangers of believing that you are a superstar youth pastor. And I almost immediately shared this with the pastor, because I wanted to be open, and I wanted help and assistance to be the best youth pastor I could be for this church. And he essentially just blew me off. He was like, well, the church sustained this many students before, and it's your job to increase the numbers. Again, notice that he was very numbers oriented. And so I asked him, how many numbers should we have? And he never gave me a solid amount. And based on the congregation size, which was about, let's say, 300 to 350, most books will tell you that the average healthy youth ministry is about 10% of the size of the adult congregation. Now, that isn't necessarily a true statistic, because there's more to it than that. But what it says is, I don't exactly remember the statistic, but it's something like it's not about youth ministry size on a different day. So if you're a youth pastor listening to this, you better check into that number. If your pastor is holding you to the expectation of having that many students in your youth ministry, you better see what those numbers actually say, and then challenge your pastor if he's wrong on this. And you can challenge your pastor, by the way. Pastors are not inerrant. They make mistakes. They're people like you, and sometimes they're people who have agendas that are unbiblical, like the pastor that I'm telling you about now, for example. And so he wanted the youth ministry to be a certain size. Oh, and about this statistic, what it says is something like your youth on Sundays, the youth that are showing up to your church on Sundays, like in the big service that everybody goes to should be about 10% of your congregation size. And way more youth went to the service on Wednesdays than they did on Sundays, because the general consensus was the Sunday service was absolutely not welcoming toward young people whatsoever, and the congregation was relatively old. And so you would expect that number to be even lower because of that, because the congregation members wouldn't have kids to bring to church. Like, their grandkids would be too old to be in the youth group, for example. So it was a pretty old congregation. And so the youth ministry would bring, the youth ministry would bring in students from the community. And we weren't pulling from the church completely. We were pulling from the community, which kind of makes this whole statistic and number thing a little more difficult. But anyway, he was like 10%. And I was like, okay, I'm going to shoot for 10%. And that was very early on as a youth pastor there. And typically also what happens, and this is a natural thing that happens whenever there's a new pastor in any ministry, but also in youth ministries, there is a dip in attendance. Whenever a new pastor joins a church, typically people use that as an excuse to leave the church or find somewhere else, or maybe they don't like the new pastor as much, or maybe they liked the old pastor so much that they just want to find somewhere new where they can find someone comparable. Or maybe they want to leave and go wherever that new or the old pastor went. So there are lots of reasons why people might leave, and so the youth ministry took a little dip. And my strategy, because I started reading all these youth ministry books like Sustainable Youth Ministry, Purpose-Driven Youth Ministry, Your First 2 Years in Youth Ministry, Sticky Faith. I was reading these books and they were all saying, focus on making a healthy youth ministry, preach the gospel, ground your youth ministry in the gospel. Don't worry about pleasing people, worry about pleasing God, and then the people will come. And while I confidently and thoroughly believed that, it felt like I was being fought by the church. And really it was just the pastor. As I reflect back on it, he would tell me, and I don't know if this is true or not, but he would tell me that, well, the trustees can't justify having a full-time youth minister if the youth ministry size is as low as it is. And so I would ask, well, what size does the youth ministry have to be able to justify a full-time youth pastor? And he wouldn't tell me. He was like, just higher than it is. I also was blind to the fact that he forced the youth pastor at his previous church that I actually attended before I went to Japan. He forced him to resign because the youth ministry was too small, even though he was at the church for over a decade and people at the church loved him. In fact, that almost destroyed the church when he forced him to resign because so many people liked the guy. And as a result, so many people didn't like the pastor who forced the youth pastor to resign. It was a really bad situation, and I was totally blind to this. But at this point, I started to connect the dots, and I started to realize that, maybe this guy, he's not all he's cracked up to be. Maybe I was a little naive. Maybe I was a little blind. So, I haven't even gotten to the best part. I was also... as a part of being in this position, I didn't have a professional ministry education. I had taken religion courses in college. It was secular colleges, and I studied the Bible a lot on my own. I thought I was decently well educated. I didn't have a master's degree, and I had considered going to seminary in the past. But I had volunteered in youth ministries. I had done teaching even. And I thought I was pretty well qualified to teach students. Now, looking back, I think you should probably make sure your youth ministers are more qualified than most of them are, because typical youth pastors will play games and not teach students the gospel. And that's a significant problem. And hopefully they're not learning that in seminary. So I think many youth pastors are, in fact, unqualified for being youth pastors, but that's beside the point. I thought that I was regardless, and I still think that I was. I think that I preached the truth, and that's the best that I could do. But in addition to the job, to going to this new place and moving my life there with little support in actually moving, I was forced to go to school to pursue a master's degree. And the reason that I was given for that was that the other applicants for the job, some of them had professional ministry education and I did not. And so to show the church that I am qualified, notice, to show the church that I am qualified, not to actually demonstrate my qualifications, but to show people, to appear to people that I am qualified, I should start pursuing a master's degree in ministry. And so I signed up at the local seminary for an MDiv, a master's in divinity. And I started pursuing that, and I didn't think much of it at first. It seemed a little unfair, but as time went on, it got progressively more unfair, and here's why. The church didn't pay any part of my schooling. I think I thought it was okay because my salary was decent at the church, but as time went on, I started realizing how difficult it was for me to, take 2 or 3 classes and pay for them all without any help from the church that I worked at that was forcing me to go to school. Not only that, but the youth pastor before me, the guy that everybody hated, quote unquote hated, I was led to believe that they hated him. He was actually a very well-liked fellow. He was also pursuing his master's degree and eventually got it. Not only did the church, he might have paid for it out of his own pocket, partially because the church didn't require him to get his master's degree. But what they did do is they gave him a day off every week to go to school. So it wasn't technically a day off. He was able to go to school, and that just counted as a work day because the stuff that he was learning would ideally help him with his ministry. So instead of working 5 days a week, he would work 4 days in the office or, whatever his duties were during the week. And he would do 1 day at seminary. But I didn't get that. Not only did the church not pay for any of my schooling whatsoever, but they forced me to work 40 hours a week, even though I was salary, and record my hours. Every hour I had to record to prove that I worked 40 hours, which seemed like, I wasn't trustworthy. I was trustworthy enough to move my entire life halfway across the country to work at this new place, but I wasn't trustworthy enough to work 40 hours a week. That's what it seemed anyway. And also the pastor said that for all of the staff members, that all of them should record their hours, but the only one he really enforced it on was me. Partially, I think, because the pastor was newer than the other staff members at the church, and if he were to do anything bad to them, it would make him look bad. And he was very, very appearance-oriented. He cared very much about what people thought about him, unless they were inferior to him in position in his job. So, like, he could do bad things to me, but if any of the older, more experienced members of the church didn't like him, then that was a problem. So anyway, they didn't pay for my schooling and they didn't give me a day off. So I had to go to school and work in the office a day that other staff members usually were off. So I was essentially working, including school, like 60-hour weeks for a solid year. And eventually that started to wear me down. And I had multiple conversations with the pastor over the course of my time working there. And I would talk to him about the unsustainability of this. Like, it couldn't last forever. The church needs to support me in some way or whatever. And his response to that was that you should just drop down to 1 class. But, because I was taking 2 or 3 classes per semester. But the reason that I was doing that was because schools, they have limits to the amount of time it can take before you can graduate. If you take too long to graduate, you might lose some of your previous credits. And for me to be able to graduate, and I think the limit was like 5 years or something like that, I needed to take an average of 3 classes per semester. So if I were to drop down to any less than that, I wouldn't be able to graduate, which proved to me even more that the church didn't actually care about me. Because they didn't want me to get a degree, they just wanted me to appear like I was qualified. They didn't care that I was spending all this money that would essentially go to waste if I dropped down to one class. They just cared that I appeared that I was getting an education and that I was working hard and that I was still showing up in the office 40 hours a week. Anyway, also awful things happened. Like he would, when I got to the town, it's very hard to find housing or apartments in that town that were close to the church, but that were also reasonably priced. And it was kind of an old town, and a lot of apartments there were really run down, and my standards were a little higher than that. I wanted something relatively cheap, but I also wanted something, like I said, close to the church. And I wanted something that wasn't in awful condition. And eventually I did find something, but it took me over a month to find a place. And I was looking for a house in the middle of having to direct a summer camp for 2.5 weeks. 2 days after that summer camp, I went for another 2.5 weeks to Thailand to lead a mission trip, again, within a month of me starting at this church. Let that sink in. Less than a month after me starting at this church, I was to direct a summer camp with over 500 students for 2.5 weeks away from my house, which I didn't have, and therefore I couldn't search for a house during this time. And then also go to Thailand for another 2.5 weeks. So I was going to be away for a solid month. And later on, I was criticized by the pastor for not finding a house quickly enough. Like he said, that was a sign that I was irresponsible. But what was irresponsible was his jumping to those conclusions and him not understanding the full situation. And above all else, not being loving. To be criticized for something that not only was not my fault, but that was put upon me by the very church that I was trying to serve and work for. I was criticized for that. That was bad. Here are some quotes from this pastor as well. He said in a conversation with one of the youth volunteers, "We gotta please the people with the deep pockets." He said that. He wanted to make decisions in the church that would not displease the people with deep pockets, meaning the people who give money to the church, no matter what those decisions were. And he wanted to go out of his way to do things that would make them happy, which, in and of itself isn't a bad thing if you end up doing things that make the people who are giving money to the church happy. But if that's the reason that you're doing those things, that's very, very bad. He also said, he would ask often the staff members' opinions on illustrations that he should use in the sermon, which were often ridiculous. Like this sermon in particular, he used Bizarro Superman as a reference, and I don't even remember why, but I remember the stupid illustration. And he was asking, "Do you think people would know who Bizarro Superman is?" And everybody was like, "No, nobody would know that." And hey, I like comic books. I know who Bizarro Superman is, but a congregation with an average age of 65 would have no idea who Bizarro Superman is. And it's frankly idiotic to use something like that as an illustration in a situation like that. But regardless of our opinions, he chose to do it anyway. And at one point, we, as a staff, brought that up. Like, well, anyway, the illustration flopped, essentially. And then the next week, he was like, "Man, I really thought that was going to work out." And everybody said, "We told you it wasn't going to work out." And his response was, quote, "I don't want your opinion. I just want to be validated." So, in other words, he wasn't actually interested in truth. He wanted to be validated. He said it word for word. It does not need to be interpreted. Imagine having somebody like that in charge of your church. It's unbelievable. So as time passed, I would become more and more aware of these things, but he wasn't the only problem in the church, because the associate pastor was also a serious problem. in a camp meeting one time. He and his wife used to be very involved in camps, and in fact, he was the youth pastor prior to the guy who was the youth pastor before me at the church. And back in his day, he had a discipleship model that he thoroughly was tied to, involving focusing on the cool kids in school. And if you get the cool kids to come to your youth ministry, with like pizza and expensive games and big prizes for your games that you do in the youth ministry, then they will bring their friends. So the cooler your youth ministry is, the bigger it's going to be. And then the more kids you can share the gospel with. If you can find time to share the gospel between all of your stupid games that you're playing. So anyway, he had this quite unbiblical discipleship model that he was constantly trying to push on me, because he also wouldn't mind his own business, and he also did next to nothing each week in his office. It seemed like he had a tenure, and he should have retired a decade ago, and this coward of a senior pastor wouldn't try to push him out like he did another pastor that I will speak about very shortly. So anyway, this associate pastor's wife, the guy who used to be the youth pastor a long time ago, his wife in a camp meeting said this, quote, "We don't want weird kids in the youth ministry. We want athletes." Which implied that the youth ministry we had was full of weird kids, and it was pushing out the actual important people that we should be focusing on, which is the athletes, because they're the ones who are going to be bringing in their friends. How unbiblical is that? That is disgusting. How can a person who calls themselves a Christian, much less a pastor, allow his wife to say something like that? Well, it's because he believed exactly the same thing. And it baffles me that a pastor would believe such a thing. I can't wrap my head around it. I did a study, an expository study through the book of Ephesians, where we would just go passage by passage. And after I had left the church, he criticized me about that to the new youth pastor, because he likes his stupid little curriculums that he buys, and he wants to control all of the church's teaching and make sure they're all, learning what he wants them to learn. And so he criticized me behind my back for teaching the Bible. Isn't that strange? He also had this weird sense of control over all of the objects in the church, because he was around the church for 30 years and bought, like half of the stuff that was in the church. And so even if it was youth ministry stuff, he would feel like he could take it whenever he wanted to, and that was not okay. And the moment that I challenged him on that, he tried stripping a room that was in the youth wing of the building of everything in it, like unscrewing the TV from the wall, and even taking the shutters off of the windows. The dude is a child, and he still works at this church. And he is in charge of people. He's in charge of teaching people. It's unbelievable. It's wrong. It's disgusting. Like I mentioned before, there was another pastor at the church. He was probably the most encouraging person, along with his wife, in the whole church for me. They were both such great people, as far as I know, but they were having some family struggles, and the senior pastor didn't like that, because in his interpretation of the rules for an overseer in Timothy, he believes that not just if a pastor didn't have, it says if an overseer needs to have his house in order. And so to the senior pastor, that meant, if you're having family difficulties, then you're not qualified to be a pastor. So you need to fix this or get out. Now, most churches, well, maybe not most, but many churches I've seen have something called a restoration plan when there is sin is happening. And I don't know the full story exactly, what they were struggling with or whatever, but, maybe there was sin that was happening. But regardless, something was wrong, and the church could have given them a restoration plan and gotten them counseling and, helped them through whatever struggle this was. But instead, what the senior pastor's plan was in reality was fix your problems or resign. And in order to do that, I'm going to force you to take off all of your vacation that you have amassed for the rest of the year and use it in this next month, which means he would have no vacation for the rest of the year. So he forced him to take all of his vacation in this 1 month, which, that didn't help the situation. And also he didn't communicate anything to the church. And so suddenly when one of the pastors stopped showing up for an entire month, people gossiped. And nobody said anything bad about gossip. Gossip was fine in that church. People gossiped all the time, and, including the people with the deep pockets. And so if you said anything bad about gossiping, you might force those people who tithe big money to leave. So in other words, it was a really bad situation. Came back, the problems weren't really better. And so the senior pastor forced the guy to resign. One of the best, most encouraging, at least to me, families in the entire church, forced him to leave. And I left shortly after because of the final straw, which was I continued to bring up this conversation about school. I became more and more stressed out every single week because I had to go to, I loved seminary, by the way. I loved it. I still attend. I still do seminary, but because the church forced me to go and didn't support me whatsoever in it, it was too much to do both at once. And so I wanted to convince the church to help me out in some way. Either give me a day off or pay for my classes, one or the other, both ideally, or at least help me pay for my classes and give me a day off. And so what the senior pastor said, he says, drop down to one class. And I said, well, I can't do that because then I won't be able to graduate. And he's like, look, let's just figure this out. Let's work it out. Drop down to one class. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to pay for that one class that you drop down to. And I quickly realized that he just said that to appease me. But the reality of the situation was the class was over $2,000. And whenever I showed up to work the next Monday, I had a check for $500. And I asked him where the rest was. This doesn't cover even remotely half of my class. Where's the rest? And he's like, well, that's all we had in the budget. That's all I could justify giving you, and kind of blew it off. And then I put in my resignation notice. The church didn't care about me. The church didn't even care about its congregants because they were teaching, they were allowing this horrible stuff to happen in the church, and he was too cowardly to do anything about it. With the numbers thing, he had such an obsession with numbers. Even one of the ushers in the church, one of their jobs was to count up the number of members to keep a tally of attendance, approximately. And one of the ushers even said that they should round up the numbers because the senior pastor likes when there are big numbers. So essentially they were sometimes at least lying about the attendance in the church to inflate the numbers to make the senior pastor happy. And in addition to that, because the youth ministry numbers were not up to his standards ever, even though the youth ministry started increasing because I had attempted to develop a healthy foundation for the youth ministry and teach the word, and eventually what I was reading in those books was correct. Students were coming. But it wasn't good enough for him, and I wasn't throwing all the money into the youth ministry that he wanted to, and I wasn't listening to the awful youth pastor who believed that we need athletes and not weird kids. My job was threatened at least once a month. If not once a month, every couple of months. I had a serious conversation with him where he was like, well, we can't justify having a full-time youth pastor if you don't get the numbers up. And it made my job sometimes not about serving God, but about appeasing people. And it was bad. It was really, really bad. So that's my story. I want to end with some encouragement. Because why should you care? Why should you care about what happened to me? Well, one, this same kind of stuff is happening in churches all across the country. It's not happening in every church, but maybe some of this is happening in every church. Churches are not infallible places. For some reason, God has chosen what we call the church to bring about his kingdom on earth one day. Like, this is his body, but it is a diseased, decrepit body in a lot of places. And that cannot be. Us Christians need to stand up and make sure that that does not happen like I tried to do. And this is why I'm sharing this story now, because we need to be aware of when our churches are diseased, and we need to be able to do something about it. We need to fix the illness. We need to help heal them. We need to expose the darkness in these churches and set them straight. We need to stand up against the terrible pastors who are doing things like this and who are manipulating and using their power to get their way. And pushing out good people who just disagree. And look, if you disagree with a pastor and they want to push you out, then get out. Go somewhere else. Use your gifts that God has given you elsewhere. Because a church like that is no place for real Christians. So here's what you should do. You should realize that a lot of churches are bad places run by bad people, but not every church. Church abuse really does happen. And it's serious when it does happen, because in many situations, there are actual pastors who experience things like this, and they leave their faith. Now, in fact, my faith is hopefully stronger than ever because of this challenge that I've experienced. And I am more ready than ever to fight this kind of stuff in the future. And that's what I'm attempting to do right now. Pastors should be held accountable. And if you're a staff member or if you're just a church member, it's your job to hold them accountable. If you have a conversation with them, or if you bring a group of people to have a conversation with them, or if you need to take it to your church's deacons, or whatever kind of leadership structure you have, if something like this is going on in your church, it is your responsibility, even if you're not in church leadership, to do something about it. Also, you should be willing and able to challenge your leadership. Like I said, pastors are not infallible people. They make errors, they make mistakes, and some of them have very unbiblical agendas, and some of them are doing bad things, and some of them are just misguided. But if they are surrounded by people not who want to destroy them, but who want to heal them and who want to set them straight in a loving way, like, look, God punishes evil and he punishes sin, but he punishes sin because he loves us. If you read Matthew 18, it's not about kicking people out of churches, it's about saving people. And so that's the kind of attitude that we should have when we approach anybody in the church who we think is sinning. When we go about this, we need to approach them with love, but not necessarily always gently. Gently, but what's the word I'm thinking of? We need to be strong, and we need to be courageous in standing up against sin. We cannot allow our churches, which is the last bastion of hope for us in the West, in Christianity, to be able to stand up against evil. This is our last hope, the churches. And if we allow our churches to fall, then there will be nothing left for Christians. And also, another encouraging note is that God ultimately won't allow the church in the world to disappear. No matter what bad things are happening in the church, in your church maybe, or in churches around you that you see, the church won't totally die. The body of Christ will not disappear. Even if some parts of it are bad, those parts might die. Those parts might be snipped off when God is, trimming the vines. But ultimately, the church won't die around the world, and God's will ultimately will be done, and the world will be unified with God one day as he brings his kingdom to earth. But that doesn't mean that we won't go through hardships in the present, and that also doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to fight against the evils that we do see in our churches. So keep that in mind, and I hope this was an educational experience for you. And if you've ever gone through something like this too, know that, God's in control, and God doesn't want you to reflect, to allow bad people to reflect poorly on him. Because there are bad people, and there are lots of bad people in churches. I've seen some of the worst people I've ever experienced in churches. And that's just the reality of things. It does not make the Bible less true. It does not make God less real. But instead, we need to hold fast to Scripture and let that take precedence over the evils of people that we experience in the world and even in our churches. So thanks for listening to this episode of Good Monsters. I will catch you next time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Good Monsters. I hope it got you thinking about some things. If it did, please consider helping this podcast reach more people by liking and leaving a positive review and sharing it with a friend. You can also check out my YouTube channel and follow my Instagram, where you can send me a message with what you thought about this episode and what you'd like to hear in the future. Thanks again for listening to Good Monsters. Catch you next time.